Movie-based cartoon series. There have been some that have really caught on, such as The Real Ghostbusters and Beetlejuice. But what about the strange and not so well known ones? The ones that slipped through the cracks and went into obscurity. The ones that many people may even be shocked to learn that there was even an animated series based off that particular movie in the first place. Well, that leads me to today's episode. So get ready to scratch your head and say, what, they made a cartoon about that? As we look into my own personal list of top 10 strangest movie-based cartoon shows. So, let's do this. Number 10, Teen Wolf. In 1985, the feel-good supernatural sports movie Teen Wolf came out, which was about an unpopular teenage boy, Scott Howard, who discovers that he is a werewolf and becomes the most popular guy in school and the school's star basketball player. Thanks to the fact that the movie starred Michael J. Fox, the film was a huge surprise hit, so naturally the following year a short-lived animated series came out. The Teen Wolf animated series only lasted 2 seasons and made lots of changes to the source material it was based on. For example, Scott now doesn't just live with his father, but grandparents and obnoxious little sister, all of whom are werewolves. The town is no longer called Beacon Town, but Wolverton, a town obsessed with werewolves. But the biggest change is the fact that Scott hides his werewolf abilities from the town, and only his friends Booth and Styles know about his werewolf ways out of fear of being ostracized. And sadly, a cartoon about a reluctant werewolf who has to constantly hide just wasn't all that exciting. The show actually touched up on some very mature themes, such as social anxiety, self-awareness and acceptance, and fear of discrimination. Why didn't the show catch on? Well, probably as mentioned, changes to the source material, and the animation wasn't drawn too well either, with the same transformation sequence constantly being reused. But it's still worth checking out just to see how surprisingly ahead of its time the Teen Wolf animated series actually was. But here's the thing, Scott hides his inner werewolf out of fear of humiliation. In a town called Wolverton, a town that's obsessed with and loves werewolves. Dude, just werewolf it up and they'll love you! Number 9, James Bond Jr. After the release of the 16th James Bond movie, License to Kill in 1989, legal issues hit the franchise, in which fans would have to wait a whopping 6 years to see Bond's next adventure, GoldenEye, which meant if you were a Bond fan in the early 90s and was feeling the lack of 007 adventures, the only way you could get your Bond fix was to watch the animated series James Bond Jr., which focuses on the exploits of James Bond's teenage nephew, who kinda looks like Peter Bateman from The Real Ghostbusters, who is training to be a spy like his uncle at some kind of training academy, where young Bond would often find himself on many deadly missions and even go face to face with some of the classic Bond villains, all of which, due to legal issues, look drastically different to their movie counterparts, like Oddjob, who now seems to be wearing some kind of funky aerobicizing attire with a huge bling chain, Jaws, who now has a completely robotic bottom jaw, Knick-Knack, who has now changed race and looks like a hobo, and Dr. No, who, now has green skin? Like, what? There are also other villains that were introduced into the series, like this weird disco pirate guy. But the show just didn't really catch on, as people didn't want to see some random kid who they don't know going on dangerous missions. People clearly wanted to see the real James Bond. Number 8, Toxic Crusaders. In 1987, The Toxic Avenger came out, about a superhero powered by radioactive toxic waste. Released by the Troma Company, the movie was ruthlessly and unapologetically violent and gory as hell. It was awesome. So what do you do with such a gore fest? Well, you turn it into a cartoon series for kids, of course. The story is basically the same as the movie, only an animated child-friendly version, where after a bullying prank gone wrong, Melvin falls into some toxic waste and becomes a superhero, Toxie, who uses his new powers to fight crime in Tromaville. Most of the crimes he prevents are crimes like pollution and harming the environment. This time, Toxie even has fellow toxic mutant sidekicks. and a four-armed main villain called Dr. Killmoth, who seemed hell-bent on destroying the planet. So what went wrong? Well, as mentioned with Teen Wolf, in my opinion, the animation didn't look all that great, but the biggest detractor is the show just couldn't compete with the impossibly popular Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, another show about toxic waste-powered superheroes. Toxic Crusaders was released in 1991, which was the pinnacle of the Ninja Turtles' success. Number 7. Star Wars Droids and Ewoks. In 1983, Return of the Jedi wrapped up the original Star Wars trilogy, and it seemed that Star Wars was now done and dusted. So the idea of a Star Wars animated series would have felt like a sure win. And not only was there one animated series, but two. So with the huge library of Star Wars characters to choose from, like Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Han Solo, Chewie, and Lando Calrissian, who does the cartoons decide to focus on? Why, of course, the annoying droids and the equally annoying Ewoks. Droids came out in 1985 and sees the return of Anthony Daniels as C-3PO as in the movies. And the cartoon is also set before the events of A New Hope. But sadly, the show only lasted for one series consisting of 13 episodes, because the show just wasn't really interesting. The locations just seemed dull and boring, as did the new characters the show introduced. It just didn't feel like Star Wars. The Ewoks cartoon was more successful and lasted 2 seasons. If I remember correctly, it was mainly the smaller children audience who liked the show, as that did seem to be its target audience. And the Ewoks animated series took a more spiritual and mythical animated approach to its series, but it still wasn't enough to have a great impact on eager kids. Number 6. The Karate Kid. Okay, this one is just weird. So The Karate Kid was released in 1984, where Mr. Miyagi teaches Daniel LaRusso the art of karate, so he can maintain balance and order in his life and defend himself while doing it. And in doing so, Miyagi also finds balance in his life too, as the teacher and student form a strong bond, which results in Daniel winning a karate tournament. So how do you make an animated series out of this premise? Why, of course, by having Daniel and Mr. Miyagi going on explosive James Bond-styled missions around the world in order to save a mystical artifact with magical powers. Yep, doesn't that premise just scream Karate Kid? Yeah, look, this show greatly deviated from its original source material, and took what is otherwise a film grounded in reality into supernatural territories, where now Daniel LaRusso is no longer painting fences, but riding torpedoes like they were surfboards, and is no longer facing school bullies, but weird cheetah gods. Upon its release in 1989, naturally the Karate Kid animated series only lasted 1 season. Number 5. Robocop. Just like the Toxic Crusader, the Robocop animated series is based on a violent as hell R-rated movie. Only there was more rhyme and reason with a Robocop animated series, as despite the fact that children weren't supposed to watch Robocop, a lot did and really liked it. So with the Robocop series, it surprisingly follows the movie's plot very closely, what with the Murphy character being murdered by Clarence Boddicker and his gang of thugs, and then brought back into life as a half-human, half-cybernetic cop known as Robocop. The show came out in 1988 and was released by none other than Marvel, and even boasted some pretty good animation that was very true to the movie. Seriously, how could this show have failed? It had a kick-ass character that kids loved in an animated series that they could actually watch. So what went wrong? Why did it only last for 1 season and thus slip into obscurity? Well, maybe because Robocop was a brand synonymous with violence, so maybe parents just didn't want their kids associated with the brand. Who knows? Granted, the show wasn't perfect, but it wasn't bad either. But I do think it at least deserved 1 more season. Number 4. Jumanji.
Welcome to the jungle. We got fun.
Yep, the 1995 Robin Williams movie about a mischievous board game which unleashes all kinds of chaos into the real world got its own animated series. Despite not being talked about much in modern years, the Jumanji cartoon actually lasted 3 seasons, running from 1996 to 1999, and used that weird Nickelodeon style of animation that was popular in the late 90s. I know a lot of people like that style, but it just wasn't to my personal taste. The cartoon changes certain plot points from the movie. For example, Judy and Peter start playing Jumanji and are sucked into the harsh jungle world of Jumanji, where they meet Alan Parrish in his jungle survivor warrior state. Yep, long before Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle came out, the Jumanji animated series had already given fans a glimpse into the world of Jumanji. The cartoon would see Alan, Judy and Peter go on a quest to try and get out of the Jumanji world, and back into the real world. And from memory, unlike its more comical movie, the cartoon surprisingly took itself very seriously and can be dark when it wanted to be. Also in the Jumanji TV series, we learn that over hundreds of years many people have played Jumanji and have been trapped in the game. Once again, a plot established in the Jumanji universe long before Welcome to the Jungle. Number 3. Extreme Ghostbusters. Now I know what you're all thinking, but Minty, we already know about the Ghostbusters animated series. It's called The Real Ghostbusters and it was one of the biggest cartoons of the 80s. Yes, but Extreme Ghostbusters is the not so well known sequel series, which tries to take the franchise and make it appeal to the Generation X demographic of the late 90s by adding in some goth and grunge and turning up the extreme in an attempt to make Ghostbusters cool again. But sadly at the time, the series was broadcast in 1997 and the Pokemon craze had kicked in by then, which was just impossibly popular amongst young viewers. And in addition to that, the nostalgic love that people now have for the Ghostbusters brand hadn't quite kicked in yet, leaving Extreme Ghostbusters to slip into obscurity. And that's a shame, as the cartoon was brilliantly written and even took the show into more daring territories that the early episodes of The Real Ghostbusters often did. It could be dark and daring, and often even scary. Not to mention the characters were brilliant, with a new batch of Ghostbusters, including Eduardo, the smart-mouthed sarcastic funny guy, Garrett, the enthusiastic team member with a great sense of adventure, who doesn't let the fact that he's bound in a wheelchair get in the way of his excitement and enthusiasm, Roland, the more cautious, level-headed member who thinks of the consequences, and fan favourite Kylie Griffin, a goth girl with a love of the supernatural, along with a kick-ass approach when it comes to busting ghosts, who proved so popular she would even go on to appear in Ghostbusters comic books in recent years. Also, Egon is featured in the series as a sort of mentor to the Extreme Ghostbusters. And those who watch the show do seem to love it, but sadly it came out at a time when Ghostbusters just wasn't a thing anymore. Number 2. Back to the Future. Oh wow, talk about completely screwing up a potentially awesome cartoon and getting it wrong. A cartoon based on Back to the Future could have been amazing, especially considering the cartoon came out in 1991, 1 year after the release of Back to the Future 3. I'm sure fans would have loved to have seen more time-travelling adventures from Doc and Marty. However, for some strange reason, the cartoon decided to focus on the domestic life of Doc Brown, with most of the focus being on his 2 young sons who we briefly see at the end of Back to the Future Part 3. And what's worse is that they are so irritating and obnoxious. And to add insult to injury, Marty, who is now a background character in his own franchise, is now a bumbling, stumbling doofus. How do you take one of the coolest characters in the history of cinema and turn him into such a dim-witted moron? Marty was always level-headed, wise and brave. This rendition is just a dickhead. And what's with the red and yellow sports jacket Marty wears? He never wears that in the movies. It's like the animators saw the Teen Wolf movie poster and just got their franchises mixed up because they both star Michael J. Fox. Interestingly, the show even features live-action segments by Christopher Lloyd, but it wasn't enough to save this hugely misguided animated series, which should have been awesome but sadly wasn't. Number 1. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. Okay, I don't care what anyone says, I will defend this cartoon series to the death, as it's awesome, and I for the life of me can't understand why it didn't catch on. Oddly, the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure series was split into 2 different cartoons. There was one series released by Hanna-Barbera, and then another one released by Deke. Released in 1990, the Hanna-Barbera version picks up where the movie left off, and still maintains the feel of the movie and tone. And the animation in the Hanna-Barbera one was definitely more superior to the DiC one, and even featured the voices of Keanu Reeves, Alex Winter and George Carlin. And it's your standard fun time-travelling cartoon. However, the DiC version is where things get really interesting. This time the animation style was downgraded with new voice actors, but what the DiC version offered was an irresistible premise that the phone booth can now travel into books, movies, TV shows and video games, meaning the show can literally do anything and lead to many creative and imaginative possibilities. The premise really captivated me as a kid and made me realise the show could literally go anywhere. Sadly, the show didn't, and didn't return for a third series. If you like Bill and Ted, you should totally check out the animated series. Just as with the real Ghostbusters, it perfectly recaptures the characters it's based on, as Bill and Ted are just like their movie counterparts, down to a T. Or in this matter, a K. A Circle K. Oh yes! Well guys, that was my look into Strangest movie-based cartoon series. I hope you enjoyed it, and there are so many more out there. So if you enjoyed this video and find this topic interesting, then just go out there and do some more exploring yourself and you'll find there is many more. Anyway, I'm Minty, and seriously, the Bill and Ted Excellent Adventure cartoon series really needs more love. See ya!